Marcus Thompson had always been the quiet type, the kind of man who kept his past locked away like an old trunk in the attic. His neighbors in the small town of Millbrook knew him as the friendly mechanic who fixed their cars with skilled hands and never overcharged. They saw him every morning at exactly 7:30, walking his golden retriever, Scout, down Maple Street with the same steady pace he'd maintained for the past 15 years. What they didn't know was that Marcus carried invisible scars from a war that had ended decades ago. In his modest two-bedroom house, tucked away in a dusty shoebox beneath his bed, lay a tarnished military medal that he claimed was just scratched junk whenever anyone caught a glimpse of it during his rare moments of vulnerability. The medal had a deep gouge across its surface, and its once bright bronze finish had faded to a dull brown. Marcus would sometimes hold it late at night when the nightmares came, turning it over in his weathered hands like a worry stone. His daughter Sarah had asked about it countless times during her childhood visits after the divorce, but Marcus would always deflect with a joke or change the subject entirely. "Dad, what's that medal for?" 8-year-old Sarah had asked one Christmas morning, having discovered it while looking for hidden presents. "Oh, that old thing. It's nothing special, sweetheart. Just a scratched piece of metal they give everyone," Marcus had replied, quickly tucking it back into its hiding spot. "Now how about we see what Santa brought you?" But Sarah noticed the way her father's hands trembled slightly when he touched it, and how his eyes seemed to drift to somewhere far away. She noticed how he'd go quiet for hours afterward, staring out the window at nothing in particular, even as she grew older and moved away for college, then marriage, then her own career as a journalist. She never forgot that moment and the weight of sadness that seemed to surround that mysterious medal. Marcus had convinced himself that his story didn't matter. In his mind, he was just one of millions who had served. Nothing special or heroic about what he'd done. The official records had been lost in a fire at the military archives, or so he'd been told when he'd half-heartedly inquired years ago. Without documentation, without witnesses who were still alive, without anyone who remembered that terrible day in the jungle, Marcus believed his actions had been forgotten by history. He'd built a life around routine and simplicity, finding peace in the predictable rhythm of oil changes and brake repairs. His customers trusted him, his neighbors respected him, and Scout provided loyal companionship without asking uncomfortable questions about the past. It seemed like enough. It had to be enough. But life has a way of disrupting even the most carefully constructed walls of silence, and for Marcus Thompson, that disruption was about to arrive in the most unexpected way possible. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements that Marcus would typically sort through while drinking his first cup of coffee. The official Pentagon seal in the corner caught his attention immediately, causing his stomach to drop in the way it always did when memories of military bureaucracy surfaced. Marcus set the letter aside, unopened, for 3 days. He told himself it was probably just some routine Veterans Affairs paperwork or maybe notification about changes to his benefits. But something about the weight of the envelope, the official nature of the address label, made him nervous in a way he couldn't quite explain. When he finally opened it on Friday evening, Scout curled up at his feet. The contents made him read the words 3 times before they began to sink in. The letter was from a Pentagon historian named Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had been conducting research into previously undocumented acts of valor from the Vietnam War. Through recently declassified documents and newly discovered field reports, she had uncovered details about an incident involving Sergeant Marcus Thompson on April 15, 1972. According to her research, Marcus had single-handedly held off an enemy assault for over 4 hours, allowing his wounded platoon members to be evacuated to safety. The field commander's report, lost for decades in misfiled paperwork, described Marcus's actions as extraordinary courage under fire, and recommended him for one of the military's highest honors. The recommendation had somehow been lost in the chaos of war's end, buried in bureaucratic confusion until Dr. Warren's meticulous research had brought it to light. The letter requested Marcus's participation in a phone interview to verify the details and gather his first-hand account of the events. Dr. Warren explained that the Pentagon was working to correct historical oversights and ensure that heroes like Marcus received the recognition they deserved, even if it came decades late. Marcus read the letter again, his hands shaking slightly as the memories he'd worked so hard to suppress came flooding back. That day in April, the day everything changed, the day he'd lost his best friend Tommy Rodriguez and nearly lost his own life. The day he'd done what he had to do, not out of heroism but out of desperation and love for his fellow soldiers. He remembered the deafening sound of gunfire, the acrid smell of smoke, the weight of his rifle as he fired round after round from behind a fallen tree. He remembered dragging wounded men to the landing zone one by one, while bullets whizzed past his head. He remembered the helicopter finally arriving, its rotor wash whipping the jungle grass as the medics loaded his friends aboard. Most of all, he remembered the silence afterward, when he was alone in the jungle with the bodies of the enemy soldiers, and the knowledge that he'd done things that would haunt him forever. The medal he'd received later, a bronze star that arrived with little fanfare, had felt like an insult rather than an honor. How could they reduce that terrible day, that loss of innocence, to a piece of metal? That night, Marcus called his daughter Sarah for the first time in months. She was surprised to hear from him so late, but something in his voice told her this wasn't a casual check-in call. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think it's time I told you about that medal." Sarah drove the 4-hour journey from Chicago to Millbrook that weekend, her mind racing with questions she'd carried for 30 years. When she arrived at her father's small house, she found him sitting on the front porch with Scout, the Pentagon letter folded neatly in his shirt pocket. For the first time in her adult life, Marcus looked vulnerable, almost fragile, as if the weight of his secrets had finally become too heavy to carry alone. They sat in his living room as afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, and Marcus began to speak about things he'd never told another soul. He described the humid heat of the Vietnamese jungle, the constant fear that lived in every soldier's chest, and the bonds formed between young men who were barely more than boys themselves. He talked about Tommy Rodriguez, the kid from Texas who carried pictures of his girlfriend in his helmet and dreamed of opening a restaurant when he got home. Marcus's voice broke as he recounted that April morning, when their patrol had been ambushed. Tommy had been hit in the first volley of gunfire, crying out for his mother as blood soaked through his uniform. 2 other soldiers, Jenkins and Martinez, had been wounded but conscious, while the rest of the patrol was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from entrenched positions. The radio was dead. "Sarah, no way to call for help, no way to let anyone know where we were," Marcus said, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "I knew if we stayed there we'd all die. But if someone didn't hold them off, the wounded boys would never make it to the evacuation point." He described making the decision that would define the rest of his life. While the other able-bodied soldiers began moving the wounded men toward a small clearing where helicopters could land, Marcus positioned himself behind a massive fallen tree and began returning fire. The enemy had superior numbers and position, but Marcus had something they didn't expect: a father's desperation and a young man's refusal to let his friends die. For over 4 hours, Marcus held that position alone. He moved constantly to avoid being pinpointed, using every trick his drill sergeants had taught him and some he invented in the moment. When his ammunition ran low, he gathered weapons and clips from fallen enemy soldiers, never stopping his defensive fire for more than a few seconds at a time. "I wasn't being heroic, sweetheart," Marcus told his daughter, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "I was terrified every second. I just kept thinking about Tommy's girlfriend back home, about Jenkins's baby daughter he'd never met. I couldn't let them die because I was scared." Sarah listened in stunned silence as her father described the helicopter evacuation, how he'd carried Tommy's lifeless body to the landing zone himself, refusing to leave anyone behind. The rescue crew had found Marcus barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion, his rifle empty, surrounded by evidence of the desperate battle he'd fought single-handedly. When Marcus finished his story, Sarah understood for the first time why that scratched metal had always seemed to cause him pain, rather than pride. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a reminder of the worst and best day of his life, a symbol of loss and survival intertwined in ways that outsiders could never fully comprehend. "Dad," Sarah said softly, reaching across to take his hands, "you saved their lives. Jenkins and Martinez, they went home to their families because of what you did." Marcus nodded slowly, but Sarah could see the guilt still lingering in his eyes, the burden of survivor's remorse that had shaped 5 decades of his life. Dr. Elizabeth Warren arrived in Millbrook on a crisp Monday morning, her rental car loaded with boxes of documents and recording equipment. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who spent her life coaxing stories from reluctant heroes. Marcus had agreed to the interview, but Sarah could see his nervousness in the way he kept checking his watch and adjusting his shirt collar. The interview took place in Marcus's living room, with Sarah present for moral support and Scout providing his usual calming presence at Marcus's feet. Dr. Warren began with gentle questions about Marcus's background and military service, gradually working toward the events of April 15, 1972. Her approach was respectful and thorough, clearly someone who understood the weight of the stories she collected. As Marcus recounted the details of that day, Dr. Warren cross-referenced his memories with the field reports she'd discovered. The combat commander's account matched Marcus's story almost perfectly, describing his actions as the most sustained and effective defensive action I have witnessed in my 22 years of military service. The report recommended Marcus for the Distinguished Service Cross, one step below the Medal of Honor. "Marcus," Dr. Warren said gently, pausing the recording, "I need you to understand something. This wasn't just bravery. What you did was tactically brilliant. You created overlapping fields of fire, used the terrain to your advantage, and executed a fighting withdrawal that military academies now teach as a textbook example of defensive combat." Marcus looked puzzled. "I don't know about any of that, ma'am. I just did what seemed right at the time." Dr. Warren smiled. "That's what makes it even more remarkable. You had no formal tactical training beyond basic infantry skills, yet you instinctively executed maneuvers that seasoned officers struggle to understand." Over the next several hours, Dr. Warren shared more details from her research. She'd tracked down Jenkins and Martinez, both now grandfathers living quiet lives made possible by Marcus's actions. Jenkins had become a teacher in Ohio, while Martinez had returned to New Mexico and raised 5 children. Both men had spent decades wondering what happened to the soldier who'd saved their lives, never knowing his full name or how to find him. Dr. Warren had also located several other members of the original patrol who had provided witness statements confirming Marcus's account. The picture that emerged was of a young man who had performed actions worthy of the highest military honors, only to have his sacrifice lost in the bureaucratic chaos of a war's end. "There's something else." "Marcus," Dr. Warren said, pulling out a manila folder, "the Pentagon has reviewed all the evidence and they're prepared to award you the Distinguished Service Cross in a formal ceremony. This is the second highest decoration for valor that our military can bestow." Marcus sat in stunned silence, unconsciously reaching for the scratched bronze star that he'd brought down from his bedroom for the first time in years. The medal lay on the coffee table between them, its damaged surface catching the afternoon light. "I don't need any ceremony," Marcus said quietly. "Those boys went home. That's all that mattered to me." Sarah squeezed her father's hand. "Dad, maybe it's not about what you need. Maybe it's about what the country needs, to honor people like you, to remember that heroism doesn't always come with fanfare and glory." Dr. Warren nodded. "Marcus, there are young soldiers serving right now who need to know that courage comes in many forms, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when it matters most. Your story isn't just about one day in Vietnam. It's about the kind of character that makes our military and our country strong." As the interview concluded, Marcus found himself thinking about Tommy Rodriguez and the dreams that had died with him in that jungle clearing. Maybe, he thought, accepting this recognition would be a way of honoring Tommy's memory, of ensuring that the price they'd all paid wasn't forgotten by history. News of Marcus's upcoming recognition spread through Millbrook like wildfire, despite his attempts to keep it quiet. Sarah had mentioned it to one friend who told another, and within days the local newspaper was calling for an interview. Marcus was mortified by the attention, but the townspeople who had known him for 15 years as simply the mechanic began to see him in an entirely new light. Mrs. Henderson, whose car Marcus had fixed countless times, brought him a homemade apple pie and tears in her eyes. "All these years and you never said a word," she told him. Young Jimmy Patterson, whose bicycle Marcus had repaired for free dozens of times, looked at him with newfound awe and peppered him with questions about the military. The most surprising reaction came from Bill Morrison, a Vietnam veteran who owned the hardware store downtown. Bill had served in the same region as Marcus but had never spoken about his experiences. The two men had maintained a polite but distant relationship for years, each recognizing something in the other but never acknowledging it directly. "I heard about the Pentagon ceremony," Bill said, appearing at Marcus's garage on a Thursday afternoon. "I wanted you to know that some of us understand what it cost you to stay quiet all these years." The two men talked for hours that day, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. Bill revealed that he'd struggled with guilt and nightmares for decades, feeling like he hadn't done enough, hadn't been brave enough. Learning about Marcus's actions and his decades of silent service helped Bill understand that heroism came in many forms, including the quiet dignity of carrying invisible wounds without complaint. As word spread beyond Millbrook, Marcus began receiving letters from across the country. Veterans Affairs offices forwarded messages from other soldiers who had been lost in bureaucratic oversights, thanking him for bringing attention to their situation. Families of fallen soldiers wrote to express gratitude for his service and sacrifice. Most surprisingly, he received a letter from Maria Rodriguez, Tommy's younger sister, who had spent 50 years wondering about her brother's final moments. "Sergeant Thompson," she wrote, "my family has always wondered if Tommy suffered, if he was alone when he died. Knowing that you were there, that he had someone who cared enough to risk everything to bring him home, gives us a peace we never thought we'd find." Dr. Warren called to inform Marcus that Jenkins and Martinez both planned to attend the Pentagon ceremony. Neither man had seen Marcus since that terrible day in 1972, but both had requested the opportunity to thank him in person. Jenkins, now a retired school principal, had followed Marcus's story in the news and wanted to tell him how the life he'd saved had been spent teaching children for 38 years. Martinez, a grandfather of 12, had written a letter that Dr. Warren read to Marcus over the phone. "Sergeant Thompson, because of your courage, I got to see my children born, walk my daughters down the aisle, and hold my grandchildren. Every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary day of my life has been a gift that you gave me in that jungle." Sarah watched her father's transformation with amazement and some concern. The attention clearly made him uncomfortable, but she could also see something changing in his posture and the way he carried himself. For the first time in her life, Marcus was beginning to stand a little straighter, to speak about his past without the crushing weight of shame and regret. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Washington, Marcus sat on his porch with Scout, looking up at the same stars he'd watched from his garage roof for 15 years. But now, instead of feeling like a fraud or a man hiding from his past, he was beginning to understand that his story was bigger than his own pain, that his actions had ripples extending far beyond what he'd ever imagined. The Pentagon ceremony took place on a bright October morning, in a room filled with military officials, family members, and media representatives. Marcus wore his only suit, the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral 20 years earlier. With Sarah at his side, wearing a dress the color of autumn leaves, he carried the scratched bronze star in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the journey that had brought him to this moment. As they entered the ceremonial hall, Marcus spotted two elderly men standing near the front row, both wearing military dress uniforms adorned with their own service ribbons. Even after 50 years, he recognized them immediately. Jenkins and Martinez, the men whose lives he'd saved, now grandfathers with silver hair and laugh lines earned through decades of the ordinary joys he'd made possible. The reunion was emotional beyond words. Jenkins, tears streaming down his face, simply embraced Marcus and whispered, "Thank you for bringing me home to my family." Martinez, typically more reserved, shook Marcus's hand with both of his own and said, "I have 12 grandchildren who exist because of your courage. They all know your name." The ceremony itself was conducted with military precision and genuine reverence. A 3-star general read the citation, describing Marcus's actions in terms that made them sound larger than life. Yet somehow Marcus felt that the words finally captured the truth of what had happened in that jungle clearing. This wasn't about glory or heroism in the abstract. It was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when love and duty demanded it. When the Distinguished Service Cross was pinned to Marcus's lapel, replacing the bronze star that had carried his guilt for so many decades, he thought about Tommy Rodriguez and the dreams that had died with him. But for the first time, he also thought about the dreams that had lived because of that terrible day. Jenkins's students, Martinez's children and grandchildren, and countless others whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of a single act of courage. After the ceremony, Dr. Warren approached Marcus with a final surprise. The Pentagon had decided to establish a new program to research and recognize previously overlooked acts of valor, inspired by Marcus's case. It would be called the Rodriguez-Thompson Initiative, honoring both the soldier who had died and the one who had carried the burden of survival. Your story has already led to 6 other cases being reviewed, Dr. Warren told him. Heroes who thought they were forgotten are being found. Families who never knew the full truth about their loved ones' sacrifices are getting answers. The ride back to Millbrook was quiet, with Marcus and Sarah both processing the magnitude of what had occurred. The scratched bronze star now sat in a place of honor on Marcus's mantelpiece, alongside the Distinguished Service Cross, both medals representing different chapters of the same story of service and sacrifice. That evening, Marcus walked Scout down Maple Street at exactly 7:30, maintaining the routine that had anchored his life for 15 years. But now neighbors waved with new understanding. Children looked at him with curiosity and respect, and Marcus himself walked with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally made peace with his past. The medal was no longer just a scratched piece of metal hidden in a shoebox. It had become what it was always meant to be, a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when love compels them to act. Marcus Thompson had spent 50 years believing his story didn't matter, only to discover that it mattered more than he'd ever imagined, not just to him, but to a grateful nation that had finally found one of its lost heroes.